So I did get asked, we fixed my computer. I've got to set it up real quick. I did get asked, a couple people asked me about the main line, because that's a group you do have. And so I don't mind very quickly going through it. Let's see. Tell me when you see that. There we go. Is that working? There we go. Okay. So what to know? Mainline is interesting. They look similar in some ways to the cultural Christians. It's but it's a little more female. It's largely white. They're going to be a little older. They've been out for a while. Remember the 90s and early 2000s, they're dechurching, average income, average education. What's interesting is like they have a reasonably high view of Jesus as the Son of God, and an abysmal, let's stay there, view of the Bible. So they're an interesting group that's going to be open to Jesus, closed to the exclusivity of Jesus, closed to some of the ethics that let me say, they're going to be open to what feel like more progressive ethics of Jesus. And he does have some ethics that feel progressive, closed to ones that might be felt as more conservative. U.S. institutions work okay for them. This is going to become valid later. They left for a lot of the same reasons. Moved to a new community, had priorities, other priorities, didn't fit, disagreed with the politics of the congregation. So typically they are going to also be allergic to the syncretism, to the feeling of a Christianity that's synchronized with MAGA. Began to doubt God's existence. So you begin to see some of the eroding of their faith. Attendance was inconvenient. Life change, like divorce, remarriage, didn't experience much love for the congregation. They, again, would be a group that would want word and deed together. They'd be pretty allergic to racism, misogyny. I already talked about politics. They do need sound doctrine and spiritual formation, and we need to help them have a higher regard for the Bible. Because they're getting, as they've been out of church, they're beginning to do what people generally do, creating a religion in our own image instead of following who God has told us he is and the implications for us. All right. So as I said, each session, I'm going to get more and more practical. This is where my heart and passion comes out. This project would not have happened without Michael Graham, Ryan Burge, and me. We're all so different. And I remember when the data started coming in. I'm not a data guy. Obviously, Ryan Burge is. Michael Graham was recruited to be an analyst for the CIA out of college. He's brilliant. He loves data. And I remember when it was on the screen, like they're just so excited about what they're seeing. And I felt like I was looking at the Matrix, like that screen that everybody else could see, but it made no sense. And I think it's helpful because my passion really is church health, evangelism, discipleship. And they brought pieces to that puzzle that I never could have provided. But I feel like in some way it kind of had to pass through me in terms of like just trying to make this helpful for the church and in line with the Bible. And so all of us were, it was just a neat team that God put together. And as we get, the more practical we get, the more I think you're going to see my passion come out. If Mike were here, you'd see his passion in the data. And so we're very thankful. So first thing I want to do is use our data to break some common myths that we've held on to. First, people leave because of negative experiences in the church. And so again, that does happen. I don't want to be insensitive, but I don't want to buy the narrative that everybody who's leaving is leaving because of negative experiences, because 3/4 of the dechurched are not leaving with negative experiences. And that should shape the way that we look at it. Young people leave because of secular university. So so I'm not against Christian higher education. Please don't hear me say that. I think God has really blessed us with Christian higher education. But there's this boogeyman that's more fear-based, saying that secular higher education is taking our kids away. And our study was the first to show that the more education a Christian has, the more likely they are to remain in church. Only 3% of evangelicals with master's degrees in our study had dechurched. 3% compared to the national average of 15. So, and I think there's a lot involved in that, but education is our friend. And I think it also highlights what happens before the kids leave and what they transition into, both of which I'm going to cover. People leave the church because they've left the faith. We've already seen that there are millions of people who still seem to be Christians and have left the church. So that myth is not true, but what is true is that statistically speaking, the children of the dechurched will be unchurched. So when we talk about reaching the dechurched who are still Christians, there is a huge generational effect or impact that is going to take place if we can get them back into a gospel-believing church or not. They don't realize how it's going to affect their children and grandchildren, but statistically speaking, it does. People are leaving primarily on the secular left. So that was true in the beginning. I've said this, I think, 3 times now. The beginning of the dechurching, largely mainline Roman Catholic, secular left. But over the course of the 2000s, the secular right, now where we are now, the secular right is dechurching at twice the pace of the secular left. And some people would say, well, yeah, that's because the left already dechurched. Well, the right has just now officially passed the secular left in terms of how many people have left the church. So this is something this has a lot of impacts, I think, in where we are and where we do ministry at a high level. And again, I don't think this is controversial, whether I'm saying this to a very progressive person politically or a conservative person politically. If you go back to late 90s, early 2000s, when the Republican Party is still kind of reeling from the moral indiscretions of Bill Clinton, how likely do you think it is that the primaries would nominate Donald Trump in that season? Not saying, I'm just given the yes, yeah, okay, thank you. Yes. Not likely. And I'm not saying he should or shouldn't or any of that. I'm just saying something has changed to where that's obviously not the case anymore. And I think that I do think that you can see the impact of people leaving the church on the secular right. And what happens often is we have this innate desire for community and a sense of mission and all these things that we are given in the church. And people begin to try to find that in other things, and they become kind of radicalized and losing the ability to have nuance and balance and be able to agree to disagree on certain things. And it is contributing to the polarization in our environment. And I think those are, pretty reasonable and expected outcomes when you have so many people leaving the church now from the other side of the political spectrum. Myth number 5, people aren't willing to come back. 51% of the dechurched evangelicals said they are willing to come back today. 51%. Now, we don't have as good a data outside of evangelicalism because we really drilled down there, but we're talking about between 8 and 9 million people where they're willing to come back today. 100%, I think I said this, of the mainstream evangelicals said they were willing to come back today. Myth number 6, America's peak religiosity was at the time of our founding. So there's this narrative, if we can just get back to 1776. Now, I've got to walk a fine line or a minefield, whatever you want to say here, because I think the U.S. Constitution is a masterpiece in many ways. I'm very thankful to live in the United States of America. I also think it's pretty clear the U.S. Constitution was the watershed document into secularization in the West. So if you compare the U.S. Constitution with the colonies, the Constitution of the colonies, you have Jesus mentioned a lot. There is an asserted effort to be more pluralistic. Now, I don't think people like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson could have ever imagined where we would be. But in the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Do you know what he originally wrote? "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Ben Franklin said, that's too Christian. We're creating a pluralistic society. We need to get the heart there. So when you go back to the founding, I think we would be unwise to think that that there was this true Christianity. And again, this is where right now, we have about 49% of Christians that go to church on like a monthly basis. I think it's 34 when you go down to, no, it's 34 monthly, 49 at least once a year. And at our founding, what do you think? Actually, we have really good data from all churches back then. Pretty much had great membership rolls, and we have those. So we know that any guesses of what the monthly attendance was in the colonies in 1776? 17%. So we're not looking to go, I mean, like there's just some things, like I'm not saying there's not beauty in our founding and good, but we don't want to be kind of naive either. The peak attendance in the United States was absolutely the 20th century. Like no question. Now, there are problems in the 20th century. I wouldn't call it our peak. I don't say peak Christianity, but peak church attendance. Myth number 7, dechurching is happening primarily to the upwardly mobile. Absolutely false. Dechurching is hitting the lower income, lower educated far more than everybody else. Why? From what you've heard about the reasons for dechurching, why does that make sense?
Because those people are probably discriminated against and ostracized from the community.
So you're close, but not yet. What are the main reasons people are dechurching? Moved, life transitions, became a single parent. Who has? It makes sense that those who have fewer resources, those who don't have the financial and social safety nets, that they're the ones that have to work longer hours, unusual hours, are not able to be in church and get their kids in church or youth or whatever. So there is this, there's an American path. I'm not against the American path, but if you stay on this path, life is going to go better for you. And that path is you grow up in a home with two parents, you graduate high school, you go to college, you graduate college, then you get married, and then you have kids and you stay married. Like that's the path. You get off that path, life is harder. And so, in some ways, the earlier you get off the path, the harder it is. And these are the people that are dechurching at a higher rate. The tragedy of it is when you go back to early Christianity, to be early New Testament Christianity. It's like Christianity started 2,000 years ago. Early New Testament Christianity, as the gospel is spreading through the empire, who was latching onto the gospel? Who was blessed by the gospel in the church community the most? The poor, the women, the disenfranchised, the slaves. So there is something for the church to think about. Again, the American path can be what the American path wants to be. I'm not here to change that. But as a church, how do we wrestle with the fact that we've kind of gotten on the same path? Like we should not have the same path. There are things that we need to think about because it's the lower, the people who are not upwardly mobile, who don't have the education and the income, that are being hit the hardest. And I think this is one of the biggest indictments on, I say our churches, my church is very much included in this. Myth number 8, all is lost. And this is where I want to be careful. Where, I mean, a look in the mirror is sometimes hard, but it's good. And I don't at all believe all is lost. I mean, I think they're in the United States. Well, in the United States, I do think there's a purification that's happening in some ways. You think about the 90s and people who just weren't Christians who started to identify as such. And I think the truth is everybody's friend. Um, I think about how I said in the 90s and the rest of the 20th, going back farther in the 20th century, you went to church because you wanted to be accepted in certain social groups, be asked to be members of the country club or university club, or people will come to your business or elect you into some office. Well, now, more often than not, people mainly go to church for Jesus. That's not a bad thing. So even if it lowers our national numbers, there's a whole talk for, I mean, I think it's clear that Jesus is never going to be perfect this side of him coming back, but there's a desire for his people to be as, when I say as pure as possible, it's clear who's in and who's out. So that's good. I also think globally, if we think all is lost, we're just looking at our narrow little American scope, because the gospel is booming in the global East and global South. And some of the stuff that you're doing in places like Chad and there's another country that I heard, Cameroon. I mean, it's you see some of this. There are actually more Christians alive today than all the Christians who lived the first 1,800 years of New Testament Christianity combined. There's more. So all is not lost. The gospel is going forward. We're just having to wrestle in our little small area of the world with some things that I think are worth wrestling with. All right, those are the myths. I want to talk about some challenges for church planting and church growth that we're wrestling with. The first is the need to embrace with like this relationship between being missional and confessional. So you have the tendency is that we would drift to one side or the other. So on one side you have the more attractional church that's, we can facetiously call Coldplay in a TED Talk. There's a high level of anonymity, a high level of entertainment, and a low level. There's a low spiritual ceiling on what is going to be taught, because you don't want to offend anybody. You don't want to, you don't want them to self-select out if you can help it. And at the end of the day, it kind of becomes this: what you win them with is what you win them to. And I would argue on this extreme, they're not given the resources and the discipleship that we need to really walk with Jesus in this world. And so as a result, even though some of these churches are full, it's not the same people month to month. And it seems clear to me that although the front door in some of these churches is wide open, the back door is too. But then you go on the other side of the spectrum, which is more the church that I inherited. Great doctrine. We know our stuff. Our theological T's are crossed. Our I's are dotted. But we hadn't baptized somebody who wasn't biologically related to us in over a decade. So when I say confession, we understand what we confess to believe, but there's no mission happening. I mean, if the church is at the end of the day a missions outpost, like that was not what felt like was happening. And so you have on our side, it felt like we had kind of walled ourselves off to the world. On this side, it felt like they'd kind of brought the world in many ways. And what we're trying to do in our own church is understand that what it is we confess to believe in terms of, well, let's start with the Bible, but I would also say any of our historic confessions, those are the most missional documents that exist. So what we confess to believe is missional. We should never have to sacrifice what we confess to believe for the mission, and we should never have to sacrifice the mission for what we confess to believe. And if we've ever seen, there's no place we've seen this more clearly than Jesus Christ himself, who is the most missional person who has ever lived, because only he has left the throne of heaven to come down here to earth, taking on flesh, leaving honor to take on shame, leaving comfort to take on pain, and coming here to feel everything we feel, tempted in every way as we are, and then to take our sin, the penalty for our sin on the cross, give us his righteousness. Nobody has been more missional than Jesus. And did he depart one iota from what Christianity confesses to believe? No. And so practically, that's what I'm saying. That's like the proof that this can happen is in Jesus. And then we need to wrestle with, like, all right, do we lean more one way or the other? Like, what are ways that we can sync these things up the way that they should be? So one thing that we have, like, we call it Equipping Hour Sunday School. It's a large kind of lecture. And we did a whole series on how our confession of faith is missional. There are other things that are come through all this that we've been trying to implement over the past few years, but just recognizing that missional and confessional are it's not a tension to hold on to, but two things that synchronistically work together, because that's the design. All right. We need to return to the hard work of evangelism and discipleship. If you were a part, I'm curious, was anybody a part of a church plant in the 90s or 2000s in the United States? Okay. I'm curious if this was your experience. The lion's share of church plants in that season, they were doing something new in most contexts. Now, the new thing could be church membership. It could be expositional preaching. It could be modern hymns and praises. It could be relevant messages. It could be rock bands. Like whatever it is, like there was a lot of opportunity to do things that nobody had ever seen before. And as a result, those church plants benefited from Christian transfer growth. And so what we began to kind of expect is, if, hey, you plant a church and you're not totally self-sufficient in 2 years, what are you doing wrong? Because for 20 years, we've just seen churches planted, they become self-sufficient. Well, we're no longer, if anybody's doing something new at this point, it's wrong. Like all the new and helpful stuff, I would say, largely, there's exceptions. But like we've been through this phase. There's nothing big and new coming to most areas. Maybe some smaller towns in the Midwest, that still is true, and you can bless those towns that way. But it's been long enough to where churches are beginning to rethink expectations for church plants, and in kind of in ways like, what can we do to free the church planter up to do evangelism and discipleship? How can we take pressures off him that if he doesn't have enough Christians in the church who are discipled to the point of tithing within 2 years, then he's doing something wrong. Like that's not an appropriate expectation. So how do we support our church planters longer period of times? How do we free them up and give them a team even to be doing evangelism and discipleship? Because that's what the work of church planting and church growth has largely been for 2,000 years. This is a Lifeway. This is very interesting because this was done in pre-COVID. And to my knowledge, this survey has not been done again. So in 2014, 300 churches in the United States, 300 more churches opened than closed. And you get to 2019 and you see, and it was an 1,800 church swing to where 1,500 more churches are closing than opening. So you're seeing that swing pretty significantly. And that data is at this point 6 years old and on the other side of COVID. So it kind of just shows us not just that people are leaving churches, but that churches are closing. And that's going to give us both challenges and opportunities. And we're going to come back to that a little bit. Number 4, I believe that it is going to be harder and harder for medium-sized churches in medium to large-sized towns to survive. So there's going to be a holing out of now. I think there's like in a town like this, I don't think that's true, and some of you are in not for a long time, but in Fargo, maybe in Minneapolis for sure. This middle range of 150 to 300 is becoming economically unviable. And so I'm explain that and then explain what we lose as a church in this. So if you're below 100, 150, you're a church that's fairly flexible, especially below 100. You can find places to meet. You're probably not caring for a lot of children. You're probably a very homogenous group too that's going to live in the same parts of town. Once you get into that middle space, you have more people to care for, more children to care for. There's more needs for certain organizational practices that didn't exist. You probably want a pastor who's been to seminary, who is going to do this full time. That person probably has a family, and you figure out where you can pay, like the amount of money to pay for that person and find a place to meet is increasingly becoming impossible in mid to large size cities. And once you pass about 400, that's not true anymore. But the hard part, that like the missional piece here, these size churches are so important. They're so important because they offer a level of organization, program, and diversity while being fully known. Like you can be fully known down here. You're not going to be really known as well once you get above a certain size, but this is that sweet spot where you are known, you're invested in, there's a level of organization and resources for you, your family, your kids. And so if this hollowing out really happens, it's going to hurt, is my point. And so as churches, we're going to have to keep an eye on it in certain larger, mid to large size cities. I've already said this, the need to fund church planting for a longer period of time, I think is clear. There's some questions about what will be open to us. I do think this in the past 1 year has changed. There's more freedom. And so I focus less on that right now because this is one of the positives of the vibe shift. There's more places becoming available again to us. I am curious, because I don't know your seminary context personally. I know that seminary numbers are on the decline in a lot of places. I'm more familiar with RTS Orbit, some Southern Baptist institutions, and while the numbers aren't going down, the number of students who want to be a senior pastor is plummeting. I've heard both Ligon Duncan and Al Mohler talk about this. And so they're trying to figure out why is it that the number of people who want to be a senior pastor is so low. And part of it, maybe this group saw their church during COVID and they're like, that's not what I want to do. That I don't want to be that pastor and have to deal with all that stuff. I don't know. I think there are some generational, I try to stay away from too many generational generalizations, but I do think there's some generational things at play. But if the number is declining in terms of who wants to be a senior pastor, how much lower is it those who want to be church planters? And so I at some point, I'd be curious to hear your thought on that.
Just a quick clarification. Can you say if they don't want to be senior pastors or church planters, do you know what it is they're going to seminary?
A lot of them. So Ligon and Al would be the better people to ask, but my understanding, they want to go into ministry. They want to be able to teach, disciple, be an elder in the church. I mean, they want to be in ministry, but the ones who want to be, have the kind of responsibility on their shoulders that whatever, different denominations have different names, senior pastor, teaching pastor, some rector, priest, whatever, but like who want to have that role is in significant decline. And a lot of it comes from the discipleship that happens in the churches before they find themselves at seminary. Let's see. All right. So I have another little section on what can be done, but let me stop for a second. Any questions on what we've seen so far? Yes. You can get the mic or I'll repeat the question, either one.
I'm wondering about the correlation between less people wanting to be church planners and senior pastors and that hollowing out of that 150, 300. Do you think there's a generational fear of being left holding the bag as those churches?
Yeah. So he's asking about you have fewer seminary students wanting to be senior pastors. You have this hollowing out. Could there be a fear of, if I go into ministry, I'm going to be left holding the bag as these churches close? Is that right? That would be really forward thinking of them. Could be. I'd be impressed if they thought that far down the road. No, I don't know. I mean, I think there's something culturally in most streams of Christianity that was, it was like in the middle 20th century, being a pastor was a good thing to do. It was just a good thing. Like, it was affirmed in our culture. I think in the 90s and 2000s and early teens, like, church planting was sexy. Like, this was cool. It didn't matter what anybody thinks. This is a cool thing to do. And I think we're at a point in our culture where people aren't thinking it's a good thing for people to do. And it's church planting is hard, and it's not as flashy as it was in the 90s and 2000s. And so I wonder if that has a lot to play, which again, it comes back to us in the discipleship of our young people. And those of you who get to steward college students, we're going to talk about college students a little bit more here in a little bit too.
I was curious. So what we've seen, you had this statistic where
there was 300 churches more gained than lost over a certain period of time, and then there was 1,500 lost. There seems to be a correlation with our public schools as well, where smaller school districts, they're no longer financially viable, and so they end up getting swallowed up, and kids are just dispersed through more towns, so they have to travel a little bit further to go to school. Do you think the same thing was happening to the church in America at the same time? So basically, like, we're not necessarily losing a ton of Christians at that point in the church, but these smaller churches, which are no longer financially viable, it's almost like a sheep stealing thing, right? So, well, my church closed, but I'm just going to go over here to this bigger church. Do you think it's the same thing? Do you think there's a correlation?
So I may, you may fact check me a little bit, but I'm not far off. So I can't remember if it's median or mean. Let's go with mean. The average size church in the United States is 70 people. 80% of Americans go to a large church over, let's say, 600. So it's interesting. So you do see there's a bunch of churches, but 80% of people now go to what we call large churches. And I'm trying to remember where that line is, somewhere between 400 and 600. So there is a drift. And then you do have churches closing. And there's lots of reasons that churches close. And typically what happens is they sell the land to the developer, and there's no more gospel witness in what's usually a pretty strategic part of town. And so we've been trying to talk more like if you're, it's hard. It depends on denominations, because some places denominations own the building, and that makes it more complicated. But we've even been talking with denominations. What does it look like when you have a church that's closing or not financially feasible in a certain part of town to like create a new gospel witness? Because there are a lot of church plants that would love to have an old Presbyterian, an old Methodist, an old Lutheran, an old Episcopal building in a really strategic part of town. So what does that look like? They're breweries, they're apartment complexes. Yeah. All right, we'll take one more question before we move on, if there is one more. Is that okay?
Just point of clarification. You were talking about how. Just a point of clarification, because I didn't necessarily see the line fully connected. The and now I can't remember it. So I'm really glad I have the mic. Thanks.
That's all right. We can.
No, the church plant's lasting 2 years, and is that because it was exciting? Is that the implication that it's transfer growth, and
Yeah,
that's why the church plants were happening and being so exciting?
Yeah, that's a good question. So put yourself in Orlando, Florida. That might be hard, but like I'm just giving you this would be true for a lot. You're in a city, and it's the year's 2002, and somebody plants a church, and they have contemporary worship, contemporary music. You've never seen that before. You've never heard of that. Somebody else is doing expositional preaching and like valuing church membership, and you've never seen that either. And maybe somebody was doing it, but you're not connected online the way that we are now, so it feels like the first time this has ever happened. And so you'd have large groups of people that would go from one church to another church to be a part of this new thing that in many cases it was good that it's new and it's here, but and so they benefited from Christian transfer growth in a very unique way. All right. So what can be done? The first is to hold firm to historic Christianity. If I did not have any conviction and just wanted a church that was going to have people and work, I would have a historic statement of faith and a traditional view of marriage and sexuality. I mean, you can just see as churches let go of Nicene Creed Christianity, they die. It might take a generation or two, but it's clear. Obviously we look at it from a theological perspective, but just from a statistical perspective, you can't get around it. Like when churches let go of historic Christianity, they die. All right. Invest in 13 to 18-year-olds. This is a passion of mine because 3 of my 4 kids are in this age range. I saw a secular. He was an atheist psychologist, and it was on YouTube. And I wish I had gone back and found his name, but he made the case that children, once they hit, between the ages of like 13 and 25, 13, 23, they don't want to listen to their parents. And he said it's because of evolution. Our kids are wired to leave the home, which makes them not want to listen to the parents. And his conclusion was that's why we need other people in our kids' lives saying the same thing that we are. And I was like, all right, I do disagree on how we got here, but what you're saying is resonating. I would say instead of evolution, God's design is that children would leave the home, and sin has marred that design. And so it's harder than it used to be. And so, but the conclusion I really resonate with, like our kids need other people telling them the same things that we do. I remember when I had little kids, I was having lunch with an older RUF guy, and I was telling him how unbiblical youth ministry is. It's just these are the parents' responsibility. That's on them. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, I used to have the same opinion, Jim, until I had teenagers. And the older I get, the more I resonate. And it doesn't have to, it can look different, but the principle is we as a church are investing in the next generation. And that can play out how you want it to play out in different contexts. But we're investing in the next generation. So when we look at the data about, because you have these off-ramps. I've gotten permission to say this, but there's some new research coming out that's way bigger than what we did, that shows that, the off-ramps of 18 and 30 are really, really huge. And statistically speaking, what you are at 18 and 30, humanly and statistically speaking, what you are at 18 and 30 is like really what you're probably going to stay. Now there's exceptions, but like there's something so important leading up to 18 and then another series of life events that happens after 30 that make those stages of life so significant. So in our data, when we asked why people who left after leaving their homes left, they would say things like church, just the messages weren't relevant. I wasn't known. It's not a place I can be open about my struggles. My parents stopped bringing me. You have rise of travel sports, and those are, listen, I've got 3 teenagers. Like, I feel this pressure. I can't imagine somebody whose job didn't lock them in on Sunday, how much more they feel it. But my parents stopped taking me for whatever reason. My parents, we didn't use these words, but they would say my parents don't display the fruit of the Spirit. We used the elements of the fruit, not the phrase fruit. My parents seemed to care more about social and political things than they did Jesus. So it wasn't like Jesus informed their social and political thoughts. It was like my parents cared more about that than Jesus. We've learned recently that the attendance of a father, the consistent attendance of a father is 4 times more important than a mother, which might be hard to hear, but statistically speaking, it's 4 times. That's also a new study that isn't published, and so don't tweet that. So there's some just really significant things. So what does it look like? This is the question we're asking ourselves right now. What does it look like to be investing in the children as a church in a way when they graduate? Like they understand. They may have there's still a lot of work to do, but they have categories to be able to go out into the world. And so that's what we've been asking. We've been doing certain things, but I don't presume that like we've got it all figured out. But this is the shift that's gone on in me. I have a 17-year-old senior in high school. When he was in 6th grade, what we offered our youth was so abysmal. I told my wife, if they want to go to another church's youth, I just want them to walk with Jesus. I don't care. And now that he's a high schooler, he's inviting his friends. He feels like this is the best place for, like it's the best church to grow up in. And he got invited to one of the big, fancy, flashy churches youth group a couple years ago. And he asked me if he could go. Of course, I was like, yes, you can go. But I'm like, oh, great. He's going to get all this Chick-fil-A cards and play cool video games. And like, he's going to think we're boring. And so he came home. I was like, well, how was it? And there's a pause. And he said, I don't feel like we're doing the same thing. And I was like, well, flesh that out for me. And he was like, it was really immature. And my son's not like a spiritual giant. He likes football and girls, and he goes to church willingly. But so we're just trying to think through what is real, but engaging in fun. We're not throwing it out the window. Discipleship look like as a community. So that's that stage. Let me see if all right. So I don't know why I don't have this on here. The next, let me go back to, I'm going to do the next stage, college. Statistically speaking, it's interesting. Students who are involved in both a church and a campus ministry are 3 times more likely to continue going to church after they graduate. You take any of those 2 away, and the statistical probability plummets. So the reason makes sense. Like if you're only involved in a campus ministry, which is like a same stage of life, intense friendship, discipleship, community, and that's all you know, and you graduate, you're not going to find that. Like it's not what the church is. And so if you only have that, the likelihood of you continuing to go to church lowers. It doesn't like plummet, but it lowers. But if you're only involved in a church, and I say in a church that doesn't offer the discipleship to make that jump to the next stage, it hurts. The chances of continuing also lower some. But there are churches that do all of that. So it doesn't have to be a campus ministry and and a church separately. That can happen in conjunction with each other. And then if you want to know about the next stage of life, go to Gretchen's seminar or breakout. All right, learning from the back door. We tend to have a posture of wanting to understand, how do we open our front doors more? How do we get more people in the front door? Which is not bad, but we need to understand the back door just as much as the front door. So now, this isn't something that I've brought to this church. My predecessor did a very good job of this. But just when people leave, knowing why have they left, and do it. We call it an exit interview. Just like, hey, we love you. We're not here to shame you. We're here to bless you, pray for you, help you. But man, just tell us, like, what have you enjoyed? And if you could change something about Orlando Grace Church, what would it be? It's okay. Did you have, if you're upset about anything? And we learned some good things on the way out, ways that we can get better.
So do you do exit interviews?
We do, every member who leaves. And but it does say something about, if you don't have a structure where when people leave, that's a problem too. So learn from that leads into, there is no 11th commandment, thou shalt join a local church. The word membership is not in the Bible, but it just seems so clear. They knew who was in and out. Like, they knew. And so whatever words we want to use there, I think it's clear that we should have structures where we know how to pray for people in the church. We know when they're leaving. We know when they're upset. And you can get to a certain size where it's not that all that falls on the senior pastor. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a structure, there's a trellising for that to happen well. Obviously, relationships, like, what can be done? Like, the more we can foster relationships, I mean, it's the most important thing. And my hope is the third session is going to hit that a good bit. All right, know when people are at risk of walking out that back door. So they haven't walked out that back door yet, but they're at risk. They've become a single parent. They've lost a job. They're preparing to move. These are all big alarms for somebody that there's a risk of dechurching here. So just, again, but you can't really know when people are there if we don't know our people. So understanding these are the things that put people most at risk of dechurching. What can we do as leadership to make sure that we can know about it and that that's on our radar, and somebody can go and talk to them and see, what can we do to help you? Because we don't want the American path to be the path of our church. Front door. So what are, there's both, in terms of moving specifically, there are, we're sending and receiving, all of us. Some cities, different proportions than others, but when we're receiving, if moving is the number one reason, what does it look like to mobilize our points of first contact with somebody who's new to the city? So teachers, school administrators, realtors, who are the people that they encounter first? And we've been trying to really give those people in those kinds of professions, we've tried to help them realize the missional importance of what they're doing on top of all the importance of what they're doing. It's not like it wasn't important and now it's become important. It's already important to work and serve the Lord wherever you are, but they have the opportunity not just to show a new person a school or a home, but a church. And we've been seeing some pretty significant results from that. Finding creative ways to use our buildings. We've kind of touched on that already. But there's another end. I mean, I've seen not just handing over buildings to other churches, but there's been shared spaces. There's also seen some churches that have been able to do creative things that engage the city, whether it's a shared workspace in the secular sense or hosting things, just trying to be creative in ways that we do use our buildings. Being intentional with our digital footprint. This is a long sip here. So technology is not neutral. You can use it for good or bad. Like, so you think about some of the biggest things, like the Roman roads. Like, it was the Roman war machine that Christians used to get the gospel all over the empire. The printing press, a propaganda machine that printed the Bible in the language of so many people for the very first time. The internet in a similar way. It can be used for good or for bad, or in some ways maybe neutral, but just thinking through what is the most helpful way we can use our online footprint. Increasingly, the internet is our front door. Like, I can't get around it. Like, it just is. This is the main way that people find us. But we have also cut our live stream. We put sermons online later, but we don't live stream anymore. That we did that in 2021. And our hope was to continue to use technology. And by the way, this is my most unpopular opinion, so if you disagree, it's okay. Our hope was to really help people understand what is the gathering that you're told not to neglect. What does it look like to be a part of the body worshiping together? We want you to have the sermon, but we don't want there to be any. We want it to be clear, like what that is and what this is. And the illustration I use in the book is online worship, which honestly, given the way Paul and Luke use the word worship, online worship is kind of an oxymoron. But because there's this assumption that we're together, we're doing this together. But online worship, we likened it to a soldier deployed, a deployed soldier having a Zoom relationship with his wife. Like, necessary for a time, but not anything you would want to continue if you could help avoid it. And so what we're encouraging churches to do is just think through strategically, how are we using this? I know some very large churches that they're really happy with people moving away and never stopping worshiping online. At that church, I have a big problem with that. They can listen during the week, but we were meant to have a body in our community that we live in. I remember feeling like a real jerk once when there was a pastor, I don't know, Craig Groeschel, he started meta worship. And I was, just the next advancement. And I was I didn't say anything publicly. I was just kind of rolling my eyes. And then I heard this story about they had staff in the room that were tapping all the people, trying to get to know him. And this one guy, they kept tapping, and they were like, and he wouldn't respond. And finally he pulled a sparkler out in the room and wrote China. Like, he had no access to gospel, anything. And he couldn't talk, but he could write with a sparkler in a way that wasn't monitored by the government. And I was like, all right, I'm a jerk. Like, this Chinese guy is like, but there's this line. How do we help our church understand what it is that embodied worship is, and use technology to get the gospel out there in the most significant ways? It's hard. I'm not saying we've figured it out, but I think it's something that we're going to increasingly need to wrestle with and ask our questions. On Sunday, what are we ultimately here to do? Now, shut-ins, that's the hardest part of the conversation. There's so much freedom to, yes.
At some point in time, there was the church growth movement that had seeker-friendly services that were designed, or allegedly designed, to filter seekers into the real worship service. And they didn't move. So with a digital footprint designed to move them to physical presence in the church, do you have ways that you're thinking about avoiding the same mistake?
Yeah, I mean, I think online worship has been proven largely a failure. Brian Burge has written a little bit on that, but it doesn't mean we get rid of online material and content. I think about, like Martin Lloyd-Jones, he in London, London, right? Yeah. And he would do a morning service more evangelistically, and then a evening service more for believers. Tim Keller flipped that in New York City and did morning service for believers and a more evangelistic service in the evening. But it wasn't a different feel. It was just a different talk. It was, so it wasn't like they had a different kind of music. They weren't winning them to something so culturally different that they couldn't work them back in. It was evangelistic in nature. Because you're right. Yeah. And how many of you do Sunday morning sermons and Sunday evening sermons? I'm just curious. I don't. Okay. So, I mean, I'm thinking about like Tim Keller doing 2 every Sunday, and my most Baptist churches in the South, they have 3 sermons a week: Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, Wednesday evening. Amazing. Oh yeah. I have nothing but somebody say I'm tired thinking about it. Bless you. That's amazing. There's guys who do it.
So the church in Brooklyn that I serve had
Okay, sorry, I got bad at repeating the question. That's my bad.
okay, the Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night, and the Sunday evening was when communion was had.
Huh.
But the demographics of the church changed, and the traditions of the church didn't change until we recognized that the old people can't get there at night.
Oh yeah.
And then other options of how we presented communion as a gift rather than something that needed to be protected.
Yeah, and the point here, and I appreciate it, is like how are we reaching out, and is it accomplishing the goal? I think that's the thrust on all of this, and I think it could be different in every context. I think there's room to agree to disagree, but it's just like, are we thinking about it? Are we really thinking about what we're trying to accomplish, and if we're doing it well? There are real mental health needs in the church. Among the Dechurched, mental health needs were just, it was unbelievable. I'm trying to remember, it was the way that they rated themselves in terms of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and suicidal ideation was so much higher than the church. I mean, it was, so there are kind of 2 things here. Like, what are we doing to value mental health in terms of outside the church resources? But the other thing is, not worshiping affects mental health. So much so that we cited the Harvard study that said, I mean, this is not a bastion of Christian thought here, but Tyler I think it's Vanderhausen, I might have the last part of his name wrong, but he concluded that doctors should consider telling people suffering of those types of symptoms, maybe they should go to church. Not because of Jesus, but because of the undeniable effects of communal worship. One quick second. I'm just looking at the clock, and let me see. All right, one last thing, and then I'll open it for questions. Embracing an exilic posture. This is, I think the pendulum in our culture is going to swing every now and then. This place might feel like home for a hot minute. This is not our home, is the point. Like, doesn't matter where things are politically. I think, and we're not trying to make this feel like home. Like, we are trying to bring realities of the future eschaton here, the coming kingdom here. But that doesn't mean that this is going to be our home. And I think that, especially, up until recently, we saw a lot of fear of Christians with the changing culture. And while there were real concerns, God's people have always been exiles. Our citizenship is always going to be in heaven. And I think that as pastors and church leaders, we have a job of helping people reorient where they are in the already not yet, in a way where, and I think things are going to get harder in the future in some ways, preparing our people to remain sane and to be able to even thrive the way we see, Adam and Eve went into exile. I wouldn't use them as an example of thriving, but you see Abraham, you see the Israelites in, you see Acts 2, the all the disciples under persecution being spread all over the place. And you see there's gospel innovation. There's that's when we first became known as Christians because it was pagan, is Gentile pagans who called us the Christ one. So even like our understanding of our identity, who we are, there's just, God uses exile. Now, does that mean we don't pray like Paul did for a nice, quiet life where the gospel can thrive and spread? No, that's still a good thing. But I think we're going to have a challenge of helping reorient people, really where we are, regardless of what's happening culturally. All right. The last thing if you want, this is a free resource. If you wanted to go, it's just meant to be kind of something that that leaders of churches can go through, and kind of just a helpful conversation about there's an initial thing, and then it's like, all right, well, from this, where might we want to spend some time looking? And again, it's free. What we're going to talk about next is the art, like next session, the art of curious listening. I had made the case in the book that the apologetic of the future is going to look more like the skill set of a therapist than a 20th century apologist. So I want to explain what I meant by that and what that might look like. So we're going to talk specifically about the skill of curious listening and evangelism as a church body. All right. So question, how am I doing on time, by the way?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
Yeah, this is so great. It's like drinking out of the fire hydrant thing, So my mind's always like thinking, how do I like categorize this into the sets and subsets I know to use it? I'm sure others are doing that too. For me, I'm seeing something that you had mentioned, you understood bounded legal set versus relational centered set thinking, which is Paul Hebert's big thing in Anthropological Reflections on Missiological Issues.
Like Carl Henry.
And it goes back.
Yeah.
But it was developed a lot by Hebert's anthropology too. But my point was that I think I'm seeing affinity, or a great way to put kind of the glasses on for me over all these statistics, because almost everything you say that's healthy falls into the relational centered set group. Yeah. And everything that's unhealthy falls into the bounded legal set group.
Agreed.
And what's exciting about that to me, of course, it's more simple. If I look at it, I can see everything that way. But that it also really fits the imago Dei. That is, we are created that our hearts might find rest in Him.
Yes.
And in His image, right? And my research on the Polaku, or it's just an ideal person in Africa, a place where the church is the fastest growing in all the world, sub-Saharan Africa, shows that almost all their effective relationships of evangelism are relational, not. And I would say that our church in the U.S. has fallen into, inadvertently, much more of a bounded and legal centered set analysis of who the church is, rather than a relational centered or bounded and
no, I agree. I mean, I think we've had
sorting it makes it easier then.
Yes, I agree. So I think you have this bounded set in fundamentalism. Like if they don't, you have three streams. You have if they don't believe like me on every level. You have if they don't behave like me or experience like me. Like we're gonna be this bounded set. We're gonna keep that in and push the others out. Then you have a center set, which is more like having a well in the center rather than a fence around the side. I think those were his exact words. But some places, instead of Jesus and gospel community being the well, it's entertainment. And that's never going to be strong enough. And I love the way you're thinking. Yes, it's having the center set of Holy Spirit powered gospel community. Thank you. Well said.
I think I have a question in the midst of this. I got a guy from our live stream who's got a question. He said, how do your conclusions line up with the research of Fuller Youth Institute? But then I asked a clarifying question because I have no idea what the Fuller Institute even is. So he said the percent of teens leaving the church is 40 to 70% after high school. And then he said factors to decrease the numbers who leave: ownership in the church, parental involvement, integrational relationships, and trusted adults in their lives.
So
What did I say? Sure, intergenerational. We'll go with that.
yeah. So I'm sure it's a good study. I'd need to look at it to understand clearly where what the question is, because some of the things that you named were things that we've talked about. So I'm not 100% sure what the question is. I'm sure there's a great question there. I really do believe, but I don't 100% understand. I think intergenerational, since that you said that, I mean, I think it's, I've been I've been thinking recently about the church as a family, and how historically families are 3 generations living in close proximity. And you have children, you have parents, you have grandparents, and it kind of just goes through. And I think the family has suffered a little by disconnecting children and grandchildren from grandparents. I think it's just we're spread out. That's where we are, and there's something about that may have affected the church, and just seeing the blessing of all 3, and in some cases 4 generations loving each other, doing ministry together. So I don't know. That's something that been talking about in our church a little bit. Okay. Okay, great.
And I'll say this. I'm a church planner south of the cities. And
Where?
South of Minneapolis.
Okay, great.
But in rural farm town outside of the suburbs. What we've experienced internally is that maybe maybe it's stuff we were reading or just expectations of what church planning was like in 2005.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just really different in 2025. What are some, if before the healthy expectation, I'll take the word healthy out of it, if the expectation was viable, sustainable, on your feet, 2 years, what does that look like now in 2025?
That's a question. I mean, that's a real question, and we're wrestling through that. There may be people, I would think about people like Tony Merida with Send. Like, I mean, people who would have a better vantage point than I would. Yep. There are multiple, there's multiple church planting networks, whether it's Harbor, Acts 29, SBC, or
we've been influenced by Exponential and Dave Ferguson's work.
Yeah. Yep. So they would have better answers than me. My gut response is that it's going to be different in different locations with different pastors, and the thing that I would want to advocate for is that church planters would have the team they need around them. It doesn't have to be, a full on, they've got the band and the day, all the things, but like what is the team they need around them so that the pastor can be freed up to do evangelism, discipleship, and write a sermon. But a sermon they worked on for 8 to 10 hours, not 20 to 30 hours.
Yeah, we learned all about that yesterday, which was good.
Cool.
My follow-up would be for people who are, maybe they're not active in sending people to the church plant. Our family of churches here in the Lutheran Brethren have been extremely supportive in prayer and things like that. What would your advice be to sending networks, or just to reframe? This is where church planting, the process of church planting.
Right, there's something I got distracted because this just say that question one more time.
So I was really maybe I'll rephrase it this way. You had said something about funding church plants longer than 3 to 5 years. Is there in your opinion and what you've seen, is there a different number that comes to mind for you? What do you see church plants needing more of for longer?
I mean, what it takes to be viable as a church. I mean, I think the pastor should have a salary that is going to take care of his family. And I think that that income can come from more than one places, but I don't think he in some cases he should sacrifice providing for his family. And I'm not talking about a vow of poverty. It's not a vow of poverty, but I think that the pastor needs to be freed up not to be constantly raising support. And so that's where I think some of these networks come in helpful, home churches giving money. But at the end of the day, it's just going to be different for different people and contexts.